So we're going to start this afternoon looking at Jason Birch's the Amaraugha and the Amaraughaprabodha of Gorakṣanātha, the genesis of Hatha and Raja Yoga. It's Jason's book, and Adrián Muñoz is going to tell us about it. So Jason Birch is co-director of the Yoga Chintamani project at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and an associate of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford. Recent publications include the Amaraugha and the Amaraughaprabodha of Gorakṣanātha, which we're discussing right now, and a critical edition of the Hatha Pradipika, which we just discussed with Ruth Westerby and Jürgen Hanada. Other writings include on the plastic surgery of the ears and nose, the Nepalese version of the Sushruta Samhita, with colleagues on the Sushruta project. And between 2015 and 2023 at SOAS, the University of London, Jason was Senior Research Fellow of the Light on Hatha project and Postdoctoral Research Fellow of the Hatha Yoga project. He's a founding member of the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies and also of the Journal of Yoga Studies. And to discuss the book with him is Adrián Muñoz, who is a historian of religions, a poet, and a translator of English and Sanskrit into Spanish. He holds a PhD in South Asian Studies and is a tenured faculty member at the Center for Asian and African Studies, El Colegio de México. He was the chief editor of the scholarly journal Estudios de Asia y África from 2018 to 2022. And his lines of research include South Asian religious movements, yogic traditions, and hagiography, on which he's published in both Spanish and in English. And some of his publications are Yogi Heroes and Poets, Histories and Legends of the Nats, Radiografía del Hatha Yoga, Historia Mínima del Yoga, and Gorakṣanātha, Gorakṣashataka y Yoga Bija, dos textos seminales de Hatha Yoga. He has also contributed to 2 Routledge handbooks, and Adrián is currently leading Proyecto Yola, which is studying the history and reception of yoga in Latin America from a global history and interdisciplinary approach. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. By the way, very nice Spanish pronunciation. I appreciate that. I feel honored by the invitation to participate in this most auspicious event. Firstly, of course, I would like to thank both Daniela and Lucy for asking me to take part of this, and I wholeheartedly celebrate their initiative. So these last 2 decades have certainly consolidated the field of yoga studies. A blooming field, it has been unveiling unexpected and revolutionary findings in various aspects of the history and practice of yoga from different disciplines. Now, for the humanities and the social sciences, 20 years may not be that much. Things move more slowly here than in technology or economics. But this means that yoga studies is an exciting web of research with still plenty of uncharted territories, as well as many promising new ventures. And one of the most valuable contributions of the field has been the bridging of the gap between classical topics and modern themes. Some 30 years ago, it was rather unclear how and when did the traditional schools of yoga matched with modern and contemporary expressions, if at all. So the work of scholars, such as those discussed in this symposium, shed light on all of this. They bring their own lamps on yoga, as it were. At the same time, they lay the foundations for future investigations that can benefit from the reliable stories and materials recently published and the ones yet to be released. In this sense, philological work has retained a key position within yoga studies. Thanks to the now famous Hatha Yoga project, our knowledge of both pre-modern yogic traditions and ascetic culture in contemporary India has improved immensely. Part of this enterprise has focused on the rescue of forgotten, lost, or neglected texts that once seemed to have been paramount for the development of what is known as Hatha Yoga. By resorting to these fundamental texts, for example, we can assess the continuities and discontinuities among classical Hatha and modern Hatha Yoga. They are not identical for sure, but they may share some genes, so to speak. Thus, a long list of awaited critical editions of key compositions became one of the hallmarks of the Hatha Yoga project and related projects. The book I am pleased to present or discuss belongs in these efforts. So, published just a few months ago, some weeks, this recent release by Jason Birch becomes the third volume in the novel Hatha Yoga series of the Institut Français de Pondichéry and the École Française d'Extrême-Orient. It is less than 200 pages long, but its purport is invaluable and the work behind it absolutely commendable. As the title explains, it includes two texts, or rather two recensions of one set of teachings on Hatha Yoga. These compositions are the Amaraugha and the later Amaraughaprabodha. As with other works of Hatha, they are attributed to the legendary figure of Gorakṣanātha. Yet, this in a sense is less important than the other issue to which the subtitle of the book alludes, namely the genesis of Hatha and jayoga. On reading the two works, the public will not find common tokens of contemporary Hatha Yoga and postural practice at large. Instead, the relationship between the two set yogas, Hatha and Raya, seems to have preoccupied the early Hatha authors very prominently. So I will now would like to engage with Dr. Jason Birch to explore some of the key aspects of the Amaraugha transmission within the larger Hatha Yoga tradition. So Jason, thank you for this most welcome work. It definitely illuminates some intriguing links in the early history of Hatha Yoga, which is sometimes obscure, but always fascinating. Thank you for the book. To begin with, Jason, what were the decisions you made for including both the Amaraugha and the Amaraughaprabodha, and not just simply going for the second one, which seems to be the more polished recension, if you like?
Thank you, Adrian, for the positive comments. Yes, I suppose I felt that I should edit and translate both texts rather than just the earlier one, which is more historically important, because the Amaraughaprabodha itself has only been published as a transcript, really, in Kalyani Malik's compilation of Nat Siddha works in 1954. And if you've tried to read her edition, it's full of errors and not easy to read. So I suppose that was actually the reason why the editing and translating of the Amaraughaprabodha was proposed for the Hatha Yoga project, is because it hadn't been translated and it was in a terrible state. So, you know, it warranted more research. Then when I went searching for more manuscripts, I found 4 manuscripts of the Amaraughaprabodha, 4 other manuscripts apart from the one that Kalyani Malik used, and then found the shorter recension. So with the 4 other manuscripts of the Amaraughaprabodha, I think with the help of other scholars, particularly those that I mentioned in the acknowledgements, I've been able to do a better edition and translation of the Amaraughaprabodha, for that reason. And then, of course, I suppose in terms of the historical research and trying to understand the content, then really the Amaraugha, the earlier recension became the focus. And that really was a surprise to us all when the Hatha Yoga project was proposed and started. We were unaware of the short recension. It was only through acquiring manuscripts that that I came across it, then compared it with the longer recension, could see that it, was actually quite easy to see that the longer recension was the result of someone adding more material to the shorter recension and trying to rewrite parts of it. So yeah, it changed everything in some respects, because the Amaraughaprabodha is not an early text. It borrows from the Amanaskarva Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. All of that material is absent in the Amaraugha, and because the Amaraugha is so close to the Amrita Siddhi, and the Amrita Siddhi was also an important text that the Hatha Yoga project was studying, it became quite apparent to us that these two texts were composed in a similar milieu, probably, very close to each other in time as well, and that what we're seeing is a physical practice that was being taught in a Buddhist Vajrayana tradition being sort of appropriated and repurposed for a Shaiva tradition, and it was called Hatha, and then we start to get this relationship between Hatha and Raja Yoga. And so I think it really changed our understanding of the early history of Hatha and Raja Yoga.
I think it was a very fortunate decision, because having the two texts actually helps us evaluate like the transition or the development of the Hatha Yoga tradition, like seeing what sort of things are included or modified or adapted and so forth. So yes, it was a nice decision. Now, about the title, you translated it as the lineage of the immortals. Can you expand a little bit on this?
Well, that's one translation. It depends on the context, really. So Amara, of course, meaning immortals, probably, the Siddha tradition or lineage in this case, and Augha meaning stream, hence the word lineage. But the text itself defines Amaraugha as Raja Yoga, and Raja Yoga really is the main or the most important teaching in the text. It's the goal of the other three yogas that are taught, mantra, laya, and hatha yoga. So it was, you might say, the most important teaching of the Siddha lineage, and that's really what the name Amaraugha connotes.
So in that sense, say it can be a similar phrase to Siddhamata or Natamarga, so like a catchphrase for a set of teachings sanctioned by authoritative figures or gurus.
Yes, I'd say the early pioneers of Hatha Yoga, Matsyendra and Goraksha, in this case.
Now, I still wonder if the other possibility or another option is viable, like something like the stream of immortality. I mean, Amara, of course, is, at least in this text, cited with Raja Yoga and also in Hatha Pradipika.
Yes, I do mention that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do mention that. You're right. It can also connote probably more, stream of nectar, immortal nectar, Amara, in the sense you'd have to supply something to, for nectar. But I think that connotation is there because one of the contexts of the term occurs after a verse explaining the processes that lead to the union of Shiva and Shakti, which is, one of the main aims of the text of the teachings. And there, of course, we get to the moon in the head, which is full of nectar dissolving, and the body flooding with nectar. And then it's there. It's at the very next verse that Amaraugha is defined as Raja Yoga. So you could assume that that's all part of the attainment of Raja Yoga.
So the two meanings somehow collapse. They're always implied, or could be implied.
Yeah, I think it's a term that suggests various meanings to people within the tradition, and the text that's apparent from within the text itself, that it occurs in at least three places where I have to translate it slightly differently, which is why I discuss at the beginning of the book the various meanings of the term.
And then that's when you also called attention to other similar phrases like Amaraugha and Meritoka, right?
Yes, to sort of provide other examples of similar terminology connoting things like nectar and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, so you've already pointed out to one of the crucial topics to discuss here in relation to these two texts, especially in the light of the Genesis that you invoke in the subtitle of the book. So a very special element in this Amaraugha text is a discussion of the four yogas: mantra, laya, hatha, and raya. So as in other texts that also discuss this fourfold yoga, here hatha and raya appear to be more important than the other two. But can you say something about the order in which these yogas are presented in these two texts, like in opposition to other orders in other texts?
Yes. Well, the order of the four yogas can differ, although Raja Yoga is usually the fourth and best of the four, or the goal of the other three. But even within the Amaraugha itself, the yogas are presented in different orders. So if you look at the structure of the text, it's mantra, laya, hatha, and Raja Yoga. That's the order in which they're taught. But there are references elsewhere that refer to them, I think, as laya, mantra, hatha, and Raja Yoga. And so I discuss that. To me, it suggests that perhaps there was some redacting going on, and the author had a couple of different sources, and maybe that's why the material, the order of the yogas is presented differently. But then we also see that in other texts, as you mentioned, such as the Yoga Bija, for example, teaches the same four yogas, but in the order of mantra, hatha, laya, and Raja Yoga. And then I think that gives cause to speculate that these four yogas had slightly different relationships as time went on. And that's apparent if we look at the four types of student that are mentioned in the Amaraughaprabodha, the Amrita Siddhi, and the Shiva Samhita, which also Shiva Samhita teaches the same four yogas. The four yogas are connected to four types of student of different capabilities. So the least capable is given mantra, the most capable is given raja, and raja is the most efficacious yoga. It takes only 3 years, whereas mantra yoga, 12. But in the Yoga Bija, you see a sequential practice where everyone seems to start with mantra, then they progress to hatha, and then that progresses to laya and Raja Yoga. So that could explain the different orders of these yogas, as well as different conceptions about how they were practiced.
So I think we can safely assume that Swathmaraya more or less retained this notion of Raja Yoga, no? Right?
Absolutely.
How different is this Raja Yoga from the Amaraugha, from the one, say, in Amanasaka Yoga, which also is Raja Yoga?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in the Amanaskar, it's very different in the sense that it's just really Raja Yoga by itself. There's a mention of a preliminary yoga, but it's not described in any sense. It's just a yoga with external mudra. That could be Hatha Yoga, the Hatha Yogic mudras. But nonetheless, the whole text is on Raja Yoga, and Raja Yoga involves the practice of Shambhavi mudra. So really, even the preliminary yoga doesn't seem particularly important. And thus the author says asanas, pranayama, mudras, all these other practices, chanting mantras, studying the Vedas and so forth, all of that is a waste of time. You just need to practice Shambhavi mudra, achieve Raja Yoga. And there Raja Yoga has two connotations. Firstly, it's the best of the four yogas and of all yogas, and it's also the no mind state, the Amanaskar state, no mind. And that sort of understanding of Raja Yoga is consistent really with the Hatha Pradipika. In fact, the word Amanaskar appears within the synonyms that Svatmarama gives for Raja Yoga, as well as Amaraugha. He includes Amaraugha within that list if you look at early recensions of the text. So I think there is a lot of continuity there. The main difference perhaps between the Amaraugha and the Hatha Pradipika is that the Amaraugha's definition of Raja Yoga, or its verses on Raja Yoga, are quite sectarian. They're a sort of a framing within a Shaiva Gnostic type of context, where Raja Yoga's, for the Raja Yoga, the linga, for example, is that into which the whole universe dissolves. And I mean, you can trace these ideas back to earlier Shaiva texts and their discussions of samadhi and yoga and so forth. But that type of sort of overly sectarian discussion of samadhi, I think, is not so apparent in the Hatha Pradipika. The Hatha Pradipika is you're sort of more open-ended that way, and it's particularly if you look at the new, the old recension that we have present in for the Light on Hatha project, the online edition, you'll see that even some of the more sectarian verses that are in the Vulgate have been omitted. So it really is quite a what would you say, sort of it's a definition and discussion of samadhi and Raja Yoga that one could read lots of different doctrines and religious ideas into. It's sort of a non-committal type of discourse.
Right. So there seems to be like a constant concern about these four yogas in early Hatha Yoga. So in later Hatha Yoga, probably this fourfold yoga somehow disappears or loses force, and it's only basically Hatha and Raya. So I wonder if you have any like theory about the waning of Laya Yoga, for example, or do you find that Laya Yoga endures? How do you see this?
That is an interesting question. I think so. What we see in the Hatha Pradipika is that fourfold system breakdown, and it's really just Hatha and Raja Yoga, and Hatha's foregrounded, which is again quite an innovation if you look back at the earlier works, and where Raja Yoga, particularly in the Amanaskar, is foregrounded. Well, we get the very opposite in the Hatha Pradipika. The focus is almost entirely on Hatha Yoga, and Raja Yoga is at the end, but it's it's more the goal of Hatha. But with a lot of the compendiums that follow the Hatha Pradipika still think that it's worthwhile to talk about the four yogas, mantra, laya, as well as other yogas as well. So what we start to get after the 15th century is longer taxonomies of different yogas. So that's a sort of an interesting development that contrasts with Svatmarama's efforts to try and simplify the relationship between the physical practices and the meditative ones. And of course, a lot of those compendiums are a more scholarly attempt to synthesize yogas. So one of the mechanisms that they use is, say, with the Ashtanga system, the system with 8 auxiliaries, is that they use different types of yoga like Hatha Yoga, Laya Yoga to sort of explain or add content, if you like, to certain auxiliaries. So Hatha Yoga becomes either asana or pranayama. Laya Yoga is usually, it could be a lower level of samadhi, such as Samprajñāta samadhi or Sabija samadhi. And then Raja Yoga is the higher level, Nirbija samadhi. And then they use various other yogas for the different auxiliaries. So that's one reason, or strategy, you might say. It's a sort of literary strategy for incorporating more yogas. And so the fourfold system makes a comeback, and then in some cases is expanded.
Okay, so there's a related issue here.
I don't know if I probably don't discuss that in the book so much, but maybe
no, it's not really like this. Is like
future books.
It's because of the content of the two works, no? But then there is a related issue, and I mean the two Amaraughas, they as other works, they speak of the 4 stages of yoga practice,
Yeah.
Rampa, Kata, Parichaya, or Parachaya in the other format, and Nishpati, or beginning, unified accumulation, and perfection, as you translate them.
Mm-hmm.
So this exposition comes just in between the discussion of Hatha and Raya. So like in the middle of the exposition of, well, more or less, like within the whole exposition of the 4 yogas.
Mm.
But it feels like a little bit murky. It is not at all clear whether the phases apply only to Hatha, because they come in the text when dealing with Hatha yoga, or whether each of the 4 stages matches each of the 4 yogas, as the 4 types of practitioners do. So that the text says, Sarva Yogeshu Yogavasta Chaturbhita, which seems to imply that all of the 4 yogas are developed in set stages. So what is your stance or your feeling about this?
Well, I consider the 4 stages to be part of the Hatha Yoga practice, simply because there's a clear relationship between the Hatha Yoga, that's described with the 4 stages. The practice sort of leads into the first stage, the Arambha stage, and that material is sort of very close to the Amrita Siddhi. So it's quite clear that it goes together. And then with the mantra, laya, and raja yogas, they're coming from elsewhere. And there's no real instance in another text that I'm aware of, say, with the practice of mantra or laya yoga, where you go through 4 stages in any way whatsoever. It seems also that they're very much, the 4 stages themselves are very much based on the notion of piercing, which is, of course, Mahaveda, forcing the prana up through the central channel, which then pierces the 3 knots. And of course, those 3 knots determine the stages, or come within the stages of yoga that you mentioned. So there's a clear connection there between the practice of Hatha and the 4 stages. What we see that's quite interesting, as this material is redacted and reused by Svatmarama in the Hatha Pradipika, is that those 4 stages are in the section on Raja Yoga. They're in the 4th chapter of the Hatha Pradipika. But nonetheless, in the 1st chapter, he says that the sequence of practice is asana, pranayama, mudra, and nādanusandhana. And these 4 stages are really the practice of nādanusandhana, which is in the 4th chapter. So in a sense, even though the 4th chapter is, you might say, is on Raja Yoga, it's still, the nādanusandhana section is still really part of the practice of Hatha Yoga that helps you to get to Raja Yoga.
Yeah.
Could I just interject here, because we have a couple of questions coming in?
Sure.
Maybe Ruth, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Very exciting, absolutely amazing book. Really appreciate this scholarship. It is so important. I just had a question on the last verse of the Amaraugha, which you use as epigraph to your book, which is the yogi should be judged by the body. And I wondered, I think that's a really powerful verse. So my question is quite general. I just wonder how you understand that verse. And then perhaps more specifically, how does that relate to the Raja and the Hatha discussion that we've been having? Thanks.
Yes, I like that verse because it sort of emphasizes the physicality of this yoga tradition, particularly with the practice of Hatha. And the way I understand it is that it's sort of perhaps indicating how the guru would decide which student practices which yoga, and he or she would do that through judging the student's capacity based on a lot of their bodily attributes. So if you look at passages on the 4 types of student, as I mentioned before, in the Amaraughaprabodha or the Shiva Samhita, they're omitted in the Amaraugha itself. You'll see that a lot of the qualities that distinguish the students are in many respects physical, like strength and good body and all those sorts of things. So I feel that was that last verse is emphasizing that, as well as the fact that, you know, the second line of the verse is saying that one needs to do the practices of these yogas, that yoga is not achieved just by talking about it or by being able to read texts. You know, that's a common theme within these yoga traditions, but nicely encapsulated within that verse, I thought.
And then the second part of that was, how does it relate to Raja and Hatha Yoga? And we also have a question from Daniela when there's a moment.
Okay, how does it relate? Oh, sorry. Do you want me to answer? Did I not answer that? Well, it just relates to Hatha and Raja Yoga, because I think for the Amaraugha, the practice of those two yogas would be based on different types of student. And so.
Thank you.
So, Jason, I had a question about, because I mean, it's very interesting that you have these two editions, the Amaraugha and the Amaraughaprabodha. And I was interested in Laya Yoga, because in the Amaraugha, Laya Yoga is described as herbal and mental. But basically, the text doesn't say what is the herbal Laya Yoga. And this definition of herbal Laya Yoga completely disappeared in the Amaraughaprabodha. So do you have any hints about what is the herbal Laya Yoga?
I have looked into that. That was a sort of a focus of my research for the Ayur Yoga project at the University of Vienna under Dagmar. And I sort of talk a little bit about that in the article I wrote on yoga and medicine for that project. But it does say that verse, it says sometimes, you know, Laya Yoga is herbal, and sometimes, you know, Raja Yoga, etc. So I think it's not saying in every case, because when you look at the text itself, when it describes Laya Yoga, as you just mentioned, it doesn't mention anything about herbs. So it's obviously talking about perhaps another type of Laya Yoga that wasn't taught in the text, but the author was aware of. The interesting thing is, when that verse is rewritten in the Amaraughaprabodha, its Raja Yoga can be accomplished through herbs. So the Laya Yoga changes to Raja Yoga. So yeah, it's something I haven't been able to find any more information from elsewhere about.
Now, in relation to Daniela's question, I think of the Yoga Bija, in which herbs and magic spells and so forth are considered unworthy or second-rate. They are deemed artificial, kalpita.
Yes,
only that in
right.
that case, the discussion is applied to
cities,
not Laya Yoga or anything, but there is like a similar or related sort of classification of things herbal or no herbal or whatever. I don't know if there is some sort of dialogue or implications of one another.
Yes. Yes, there are references to the use of herbs in various yoga texts. I think the Khechari Vidya is perhaps the earliest that has a significant passage. In fact, I think it's the last chapter, the whole of the last chapter, which could have been added to the text at a later time, but that's got lots of different herbal concoctions that the yogi can take for various reasons. And I think they're mainly for curing various illnesses, but we do find herbs being used for some of the yogic aims, such as achieving immortality and so forth. And the longest section, or the longest discussion of that I'm aware of, is in the Yukta Bhavadeva of Bhavadeva Mishra, which is a 17th century compendium that has an entire chapter on kalpas being sort of herbal concoctions that are not only, they're not discussed very often in yogic texts, but there's alchemical works that are just about that type of thing, these sort of various concoctions, often incorporating mercury and other sort of metals and various things that are designed to bring about siddhis, immortality, cure diseases.
To the last question that I would like to pose before leaving completely the floor to somebody else. But the Amaraugha and the Amaraughaprabodha, they hold by name the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita. And I think this is a little bit unusual in Hatha Yoga literature. I mean, you can find some allusions to philosophical ideas, some paraphrases of philosophical notions, but usually you don't find actual mention of previous works, as far as I can remember. So how significant could this be?
Well, I think that verse is an interesting verse. Again, it's a verse I discuss in the Yoga and Medicine essay, because it's sort of showing that these yoga traditions were in some sense competing with the medical traditions, the Vaidya traditions, and saying, well, you know, curing diseases is one thing, but practicing this yoga will bring you immortality in an ageless and diseaseless body. And of course, that verse in the Amaraugha basically says, you know, look at the Vaidya's, look at these Vaidya's that follow Sushruta and Charaka, they all die. If you want immortality and freedom from all disease, then you need the no mind state. And of course, I think it gives insight into how yogis position themselves against, or in a sense above, the medical traditions, and a sense of the competition that was occurring between the two.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I think I will not take more time. Some people might like to bring their own comments or questions. So please, anybody, if you would like to come in.
I mean, we don't have further questions on the chat, right, Ruth? Yeah. Okay, so if you don't have any more questions, we can also just, you know, take it easy for this end, because we have just 2 minutes left. So yeah, I can just thank you. I mean, at least
perhaps
yeah.
I can thank you, Daniela and Lucy, for the invitation to participate in this, and also to Adrian for reading the book and for asking, you know, creating the discussion. Thanks very much.
Yeah, but I mean, Jason, since we have 2 minutes and another critical edition published, I mean, edited by you, is coming out, do you want to, you know, introduce that a little bit as well?
Yeah, it's coming out on Monday.
On Monday, yeah.
If the printers live up to you know, to their promise. Yes, that's on the asana section of a long recension of the Yoga Chintamani that I've been working on since I presented my research on it at the Vienna conference on yoga in 2013. So again, through the support of the Hatha Yoga project and workshops that we had, I've been able to edit that chapter with the help of many people, and present a translation as well as a sort of large introduction on the Yoga Chintamani, the original sort of work of the Yoga Chintamani, which is a large compendium on yoga that we're now translating for another project that's with Shaman Hatley and James Mallinson. We're translating the original work, but in the book that's about to be published, it's the asana section of a long recension where the redactor added a lot of material that's quite unique and extraordinary in several respects. So the book's really focuses on that.